With that, I'll take your questions.
Governor, ever since you were elected to a second term, you've been going around the state highlighting projects that need to be done. Rebuilds like the Mixmaster and others. Spectacular places to do television stories and newspaper stories. And at every stop, either I or somebody else in this media corps asked you about paying for all this stuff, and you always deferred. You always deferred. You never ever put your political stuff on the line on how to pay for this stuff. So isn't part of this your fault?
You're wrong. I have said repeatedly that the state needed to do something.
But you never said what? You never would say anything about tolls. You never said
that's totally.
You appointed a committee that came up with all of these things. You never endorsed anything. Anything. He at least endorsed something.
Okay. Next question.
Well, what's your answer? It is your fault.
I disagree with you. That was my answer. I have repeatedly said tolls need to be considered. I've repeatedly said that the tax revenue was declining rapidly. You've heard me say that. You've heard me engage in that discussion. You may decide to forget it today, but that's your option. I don't have that option.
You didn't push any of your push towards doing it.
No, unfortunately, you're wrong. And I'll point one obvious thing out to you, for which I was criticized by you and others. And that was to take 1/2 cent of the sales tax and apply it to transportation. No governor had ever done that before. So let me point out to you that you're wrong. And you're wrong because you choose to ignore those steps that I have taken.
You lockbox first. You always said that.
No.
I'm going to do a lockbox first.
No, and again, let me just point out to you that the 1/2 cent was set aside without a lockbox. Now, you should pose your questions to other people who voted against the lockbox. That could have been on the ballot and already in place. But you, quite frankly, have chosen not to criticize that decision when it was made. So, you know...
it's just a question, Governor, not criticism.
No, and I'm not being critical of you. Just a comment. Just a comment, not being critical of you. The reality is, name another governor in the state of Connecticut who was able to get 1/2 cent set aside of the sales tax. Name one.
They weren't.
Thank you.
Governor, what does this all mean for your...
I had made eye contact. No, I'll come back to you. I had made eye contact with Paz, and then I'll go right back to you. I promise.
What? One of the questions that will be raised in the legislature is why now? These are trend lines that you've been talking about, Commissioner Rediker has been talking about, and now what you're presenting clearly is an account that meant to grab the attention of the business community and the legislature. So anyway,
sure.
But why now? Why not a year? Why not do this presentation a year ago at the start of the session as part of your budget message?
I think it's a fair question. As you know, I advocated for the lockbox. Republicans in the legislature made a conscious decision not to vote for that, although many of them subsequently voted for the very same language in essence. They kept it off the ballot. During that period of time that it was kept off the ballot, things have gotten worse more rapidly. Mileage is down. Cars are going further on less gas. I have talked about that time and time. In fact, everywhere I went to talk about transportation, I talked about that. Everywhere I went. And you know, the chairman's watched what I've done, and I've watched what he's done, including having the committee even vote out steps for tolls, but to no avail. There are steps that could have been taken even this year. For instance, we recommended, and it was actually adopted, that certain revenues tied to cars be slid over to the STF. Now, the legislature has done that, but they've done it effective 2021. Quite frankly, ignoring the fact that the fund, and by the way, this is not a brand new chart. This trend has existed throughout. The legislature has had this trend time and time again. It's one of the reasons the chairman has tried to drag the committee in a direction. Quite frankly, I believe he's tried to drag others in that direction. But, you know, we didn't have a budget for a long period of time. The legislature took an extraordinary amount of time to come up with that budget, and now we turn to other things.
In hindsight, was it in the state to insist on the lockbox rather than embrace Representative Guerrero, who you just praised as a hero for his advocacy of tolls?
No, I don't believe so, because I don't believe that if in fact you look at the history of the discussions of tolls in the state, I think it was literally impossible to assume that tolls would be passed without a lockbox. What I think was, when it finally came to a vote, when Republicans finally had the chance to get their wish, which they had had on record for at least a decade, a significant number of them refused to put it on the ballot. That's what I think was a mistake.
You want to put more money?
Oh, no, wait a minute, 1 second.
30 years, $100 billion, you propose that.
Yep.
How does that look at this point, Governor?
I think it's the only way to make progress, quite frankly. The vast majority of any expenditures that will be made, unless the legislature acts to add revenue, will be for simple maintenance. And that's about $60 billion of that $100 billion. So, you know, much was made of $100 billion. What we were in essence saying is maintaining the status quo, even under those circumstances, was insufficient. Therefore, we needed to spend an additional $30 to $40 billion. And that would allow for projects like the Mixmaster, where we have been routinely. It would allow for other bridge replacements, where we have been routinely. It would allow now, and I think we'll stay on that with federal dollars, other projects like the Walk Bridge. So this is not new. We've been talking about transportation since the day I was elected. And point of fact, the legislature, not only did it not find additional revenue till I held their feet to the fire on the half-cent, for which I was roundly criticized for quote-unquote raising taxes, but that very same legislature in 2012 cut the gas tax in special action. That compounded the problems of reducing the gas tax years before without a replacement revenue source. So listen, I think we got to do something about transportation. I don't think Connecticut has been competing well against our major competition, New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts, in large part, because of our failure to invest in transportation. I hope, let me be very clear, that the legislature will act on these issues. As they have needed to act, and as I pointed out, the chair has recognized they needed to act.
Is the basic solution here to put more money into the transportation fund? And if so, where might that money come from?
Well, I think that we can have a very pointed discussion about what the immediate elimination of $4.8 billion in investments would look like, and an immediate discussion about what a Department of Transportation substantially smaller in size would mean to the state. Or we can have a serious discussion about identifying revenue sources that would come on before 2021.
So you do want to put more money into the fund ultimately?
I believe that we need to put more money into the fund. Yes, that's true.
So can you provide sort of a timeline? The commissioner said there would be hearings probably in February, but when are the bonds needed right now? When would these expenditure adjustments would you see having to take place?
Well, I think the specific, and correct me if I'm wrong, was specifically about bus and rail fare increases, and that has a statutory requirement with respect to, and under agreements with Metro North has specific steps that we have to take to raise fares.
Okay, what about the bonding? You said you need to have that approved, you can't do it if it's...
Well, we will have to, well, I think in the absence of real action, then the steps that are identified would be necessary to put us in a position to bond.
When?
January.
January is when you...
January, well, whenever we need to go to the marketplace. January, February, March, April, whenever we go to the marketplace, or we will have to substantially change the spending plan so that the fund would not go into negative
So you
territory.
could go to the bond market and borrow in January, February, March?
You can borrow any month.
Pardon me?
You can borrow any month.
Well, when do you need to borrow?
We traditionally borrow the bulk of transportation dollars in the first 2 months of the year.
How will it be a complicating factor that this would be both an election year and your final year in office?
Well, that's one of the reasons I was so desperate to get the change in the Constitution on the ballot a year ago, and that didn't happen. And because I am more than happy to spend, and have spent, although we had a little dust up in how the question was posed, I have never shied away from the fact that transportation is probably the biggest issue hurting Connecticut's economy. And that's based on discussions I have on a routine basis with corporate leaders. So there's been no backing away from this issue. Getting the legislature to identify revenue sources has been, and again, I don't mean to pick on you, Mr. Chairman, but the reality is he hasn't been able to do it. I haven't been able to do it. And that leads us to having to take the steps that we have to take.
Given the fact that you haven't been able to do that over 7 years, your 7 years in office, would you call that a political failure, at least in part?
No, let me go back. I think you're ignoring a half cent from the sales tax that has specifically been diverted and was never done by any governor previously.
But it hasn't been enough, correct?
It hasn't been enough to
And
keep...
that's what I'm asking. If this has not been enough, what you've been able to do hasn't been enough, would you consider that at least partially your political failure to convince the legislature?
Listen, I will take in some measure responsibility for the legislature not acting, if that's what you're asking. But I am not a member of the legislature, nor have I declined to inform them of the perils of not investing in transportation. You know, some light was made of a panel that we put together to study all the options. That report was made available in its entirety to every member of the legislature serving at that time, and is online, as was the spending plan that would have been supported by those steps to be taken. The timing with respect to the failure to get a lockbox, tell me another governor who got a majority on a lockbox vote. Now, I didn't get the supermajority the first time, I got it the next time. But unfortunately, that delayed the ability to have that on a prior year's ballot. I think we would be in far better position. I think the chair would have been in better position during the session if the lockbox had been passed. And since he's nodding, I think that's true. The other thing I would point out to you, and let me be very clear, there were steps in the Democratic budget which was voted against in both the Senate and the House that would have addressed this. So with all due respect to the way the question was posed, we have been attempting to do something about this for a long, very long period of time. And it would only be amnesia on people's part to forget that. No, right, and then I'll go.
In order to maintain the status quo, do you need the bonding capacity and to raise fares on public transit riders?
Well, yeah,
and why is the gas tax not part of?
I think a gas tax can be part of. I think tolls can be part of. Have I ever said that those things couldn't be part of? The only ones that we directly impact are fares. That's why. So the administration can move fares. I have moved fares. By the way, let me back up to the original question. I have stuck my neck out and raised fares in the past and be roundly criticized for doing that. So that's a second one. It's not just the half cent. It's raising fares. We've done it.
Does it have to be a combination of bonding and the fare increases in order just to maintain the status quo of current?
So status quo is status quo of what we believe we need to spend, right? So there's a very exhaustive list of what would move forward under any circumstances and what would likely have to be deferred, delayed, or eliminated. There's a reason we're giving you all that information. We want you to disseminate it. We want the public to understand. The public's always for a transportation project that's in their neighborhood. With sight lines or volume aside, the public largely supports transportation projects that will solve their problem. What they question is expenditures on anything else that solves someone else's problem. We need to have a broader agreement on moving the state forward in its entirety. Yes?
Well, off the topic, Governor.
No, well, hang on a second. If it's off the topic, there was somebody. No.
Everything from January onward is going to be based on what happens in November. Where do you find the political will to actually pass tolls in the legislature, and what can you use?
Listen, I think that you know, there are expenditures that no doubt will be deferred. The more revenue there is in the out years, so that we can go to the bond market, the fewer deferrals there will be. So I am hopeful that in the current budget or current budget projections, the legislature will see fit to move this question along. I know that this question would have been moved along under the Democratic budget. That's a reality. But you know, it did not receive support in the Senate. As a result, we're in this situation.
How much additional money each year do you think needs to go?
Okay, I'll ask you, because it's a follow-up, then I'll come. Okay.
But as a standalone option, if legislation were to be put out there on the floor that tolls were going to be enabled in Connecticut, I think it's safe to say there are several people in both chambers who wouldn't want to vote for this. And given the numbers, how do you try and get some sort of momentum?
First of all, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying a particular funding source. I'm saying we need funding. So to try to have a discussion about only one funding source, you know, but
reasonably it's the most obvious.
It certainly is the only one that would have out-of-state people pay at least 30% of the obligation, if that's what your point is. In an industry, particularly trucking, where people avoid buying their gas here to buy it in less expensive states. So by and large, out-of-state trucks are you know, not paying, I would argue, their fair share.
Aren't they assessed because of their logs?
They are partially assessed because of their
They are
logs.
paid. They are paid.
No, I just said they're not paying their, they're not paying what a resident with a car registered in any town in our state, plus buying gas in our state, is paying. So let's not try to.
They do pay for driving.
They pay for some use, yes, but you pay more to use your car as a percentage of the commerce that you conduct versus what a out-of-state trucker pays.
How much money per year do you think needs to be put into the special transportation fund?
Well, I think it speaks for itself. It needs to be brought into balance as quickly as possible. So the minimum would be reflected in that chart. So you need to get that chart into balance, and that's why that chart was specifically provided. And he's a little more technical than I am. Look at the chart.
As much as there was no appetite for increasing taxes this time, which you said and the legislative leaders on both sides agreed to, what makes you think there's going to be any appetite for it in election?
There may not be, but I don't think there's a particular appetite amongst state senators and representatives to see the project that they want to see built come off the list. I can't imagine any state senator in the region of Waterbury wants to see the Mixmaster delayed till it falls down. I can't imagine that someone in New Haven believes that we shouldn't finish certain projects there, including the parking garage, which has long been delayed by New Haven, but they've always operated on the assumption it was going to be built. If things don't change, it's not going to be built. I can't imagine legislators in Stamford who will now have to wrap their heads around the fact that there's no longer the ability to build a replacement garage in Stamford after years of delay on that project. You know, when folks chose to delay projects, it was always with the assumption that they would get built down the road. That assumption is no longer an operating assumption in Connecticut.
Does this warrant a special session?
You got to speak up. Go ahead.
Does this warrant a special session? I mean, I foresee like you wait a whole session, regular session, you're not going to get this done until May.
No, what I would argue is that the legislature needs to get out of its comfort zone and stop waiting to do all of their work in the last 48 hours. And there's no reason that some steps couldn't be taken to help resolve this issue in a special session, if that's what they decide they want to do. We had that discussion yesterday, or earlier in the session than otherwise they're accustomed to. I'm sure the chairman of the Transportation Committee is ready to start a discussion on this anytime. But I think the reason that we are specifically supplying you with more information on this than we otherwise sometimes do is I think there has to be an appreciation on a statewide basis that, yes, the project that you're relying on, that's on the list too.
Well, you're taking hostages with this, and I don't mean that as a pejorative, but as a political matter, you are spelling it out the way I read this to every member of the General Assembly who's not going to read or perhaps absorb the chart you preferred to open with. But with the list of these, they seem to touch every district in the General Assembly. Is that fair?
I don't want to verify that they touch every district as a project, but they certainly touch every citizen based on their living in the state of Connecticut.
So you're grabbing the legislature by the lapels with this. Is that fair?
I'm trying other methods, and this one is backed up by Wall Street.
So what has Wall Street told you?
That effectively we have to, effectively we have to resolve this issue. We have to reduce our expenditure levels drastically, or we have to address a revenue source in the not too distant future.
I mean, have you threatened to change the?
No, I think it goes beyond that. People will not finance bond sales on an STF that's not in balance for a 5-year period of time.
Governor, looking ahead to the race next year, have you had any conversations with Mayor Broden? Do you think he would make a good choice to be your successor?
I know all the Democratic candidates who are currently running, and I have worked with all the Democratic candidates who are currently running, and I don't think we know all the Democratic candidates yet, so I think I'll reserve judgment. But I have had a long-term relationship with Mayor Broden, but I've had a long-term relationship. One of the folks running is a former commissioner of mine who I think highly of. There's lots of people I think highly of.
And do you hope whoever becomes your party's nominee would share the same priority in transportation? Do you think that's something you hope whoever?
Listen, I think people running for office get to set their own priorities. Clearly, my predecessors did not think this was a priority. Clearly, I'm the exception in thinking it's a priority. Clearly, the voters will have to decide if it's a priority for them.
Have you given this information in the same way to the legislative leaders before you did this news conference?
I think we did. Yes.
When was
yes,
that?
they were briefed today.
Today?
Yeah.
And was there a response from them?
I did not personally do it, so I don't know if
Why didn't you do it?
because I don't frequently do those things. We obviously have done a lot of work on this document. I was very much involved in the document itself, and many of those briefings involve staff.
It was while you were at the DRS anyway, wasn't it?
I don't know what the exact timing of it was, to tell you the truth.
Commissioner, there was a lot of noise raised over a mileage-based tax on drivers, or whatever you want to call it. Are there any?
Wait. That's a third attempt of things I tried to do. Back to you. Back to you.
That was one of the items that was recommended or suggested
Back
as
to
a
you.
possibility.
Yes.
By your.
And we fought for it.
I don't believe you fought for it.
Oh yeah, we did. Yeah, we did. And in point,
fought for the
and
mileage
point
tax?
of yeah. Oh, absolutely. It was included as an initiative of this administration to study that, so that we would be in a position to make a determination.
The legislature short-circuited it because
they didn't like it,
the idea.
right? Well, watching your coverage, I thought you didn't like the idea.
Well, no, all I did was tell the story.
Oh.
Can I get tickets to this at some point?
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, Commissioner, do you, aside from that study, are there any other funding sources that the DOT is looking into outside of cuts and what's been presented here to try and raise revenue that you would care to enlighten us with?
I think it is fair to say that we're open to any way to resolve this issue, and we have laid out one way to do that, and that is to make the cuts that we've talked about.
Right, but outside of cuts, I mean, tolls is one, are there any others that?
Sure.
departments explore?
You could set aside additional portion of the sales tax. You could set aside, you could transfer car sales, taxes on car sales or used car sales more immediately. That would actually take, that would be a very, if that was to show up as a revenue source before 2021, that itself, in and of itself, would go a long way to resolving this problem.
And for the commissioner, is the amount that you're seeking to put into the special transportation fund essentially the current cumulative, the proposed cumulative balance, or is it sort of just enough to keep it above zero? And how much?
I'll let him answer that, but I think we got to get to balance first. This is not unlike my discussion of yesterday with the legislative leaders. The most immediate goal is to get to balance. When we get to balance, we will resolve the temporary problem or a portion of the problem. But ultimately, this is the year the state has to make a decision about where it wants to go transportation-wise. Do you want to keep losing jobs to other states because they have better transportation systems, or do you at least want to make the promise and have people believe it that you're going to change the road that you're on?
So is what you want here almost $1 billion over 5 years?
So you need to balance the budget, have a cumulative surplus, but it has to create sufficient revenue coverage that the bond market will sell bonds, and the lower the coverage ratio has to be above 2, but the closer to 2 it is, the more expensive it is to borrow, making projects more expensive to do. The urgency is to balance it and have a coverage ratio to sell bonds now. But the goal would be more to get better bond ratings, lower costs for debt service, and do more projects.
And so what is the minimum amount of additional revenue if you don't do the cuts? What is the minimum amount of additional revenue you would need in the coming year?
You would, it's not the coming year. I want to be very clear. It's the coming 5 years. You have to resolve that issue. And that answer is right before you. It's in the chart. That's where any discussion has to start. Not finish, but start. I think you're asking about the start. The start is you have to be able to show a surplus over a 5-year period of time. I don't know how much clearer I could be on that. Last one, you're it. You're it. You understand this?
Does
Okay.
the bonding cap that was passed in this recent budget, does that hinder your ability
It potentially
to-
does, but it potentially does because it limits the ability to use general obligation bonds on transportation should the legislature decide to allow that, which it doesn't currently allow. So, but other states allow for that, and we now have a cap on that spending issue. Quite frankly, it's one of the reasons I opposed the cap most of the time, and then finally when it was a matter of life or death, get a budget or not, I understood why the legislature, why people who knew better capitulated. Okay, thank you all very much.
Commissioner, can you just answer one question before you leave, Commissioner? As you came from New Jersey, are they doing better? No.
They have to raise revenue, so we're shutting.